All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to another instance of Loud and Clear, our LimaCharlie kind of training / webinar series where we focus on a specific part of the platform and then take a chance to review how that platform part is integral to LimaCharlie, ways to use it, and things like that. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Looking forward to kind of going through. I don't know if we'll take the full hour for our Loud and Clear webinar today, but it will still be a very, very beneficial session for a lot of folks out there, especially as we talk about how API integrations can be utilized within LimaCharlie. I'm not going to cover every single API integration that we have. However, I will happily demonstrate kind of how they work, how we use them, and how I would encourage you to incorporate them into your workflows as well. Awesome. I got a loud and clear from my audience. Loving it, loving it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. I'm going to bring up a quick LimaCharlie dashboard here, or a quick kind of, initial login screen for you. Let's move myself to the bottom. Maybe that's a little bit better. I wish I could move myself around, but we'll stick right there for right now. In any event, when we're in our initial LimaCharlie dashboard here, or in kind of our initial organization landing screen, we've got, our different sensors, different capabilities. There's not really an API place right here in front where we can just kind of turn things on. In order to get insight into the different APIs that we have and how to use them, you want to actually hop over to the API in the API section in the add-ons marketplace. This is where, and this might be a little bit of a different approach for folks, but this is where you will turn on, or the word that we use here is subscribe to an API within LimaCharlie. And what that does is essentially exposes that API's capabilities to your organization so that you can utilize them. It's not an automatic turn on, meaning it doesn't automatically start to enrich or add to data events when you turn it on or when you subscribe to it. There's still some additional configuration we need to do. And I'll talk about that in just a moment or two. But it's important to know where I can go to access these. And over in the API section of the marketplace is going to be the first place to go through and hit those. We've already got a bunch of different APIs available and listed here. Alpha Mountain is a company that we actually first talked with them about building this API almost a year ago. Took a few months, but we were able to pull that together earlier in 2023. Echo Trail for insights into file name and hash values. Gray Noise, fantastic resource. Big friends of LimaCharlie. They actually spoke at our mission control event for IP reputation and information like that. Hybrid Analysis, aka Falcon Sandbox, is another one that can be used for malware lookup and malware analysis capabilities. Insight is actually not an API call, but one that provides different functionality for LimaCharlie. There's IP geolocation. We've got a few different plugins for Pangea, everything from their domain, file, IP URL, and user reputation. And then, of course, the kind of legacy one that, we would expect everyone to have, which is VirusTotal. Now, note, every API listed here is listed as free, but as I mentioned in the very beginning, it is free for you to turn on that capability and use it to enrich your data. It is not a free API hookup. And I'll show you easiest example here is VirusTotal. If we were giving away a free VirusTotal key, I know everyone would be all about that. However, there's two steps to this here, and we usually call them out here in the window when they're available. The first thing that we do is we subscribe to the API add-on, and then you go in and you set your API key. So even though it is marked for free in LimaCharlie, you do still need to go to that respective website and grab that particular API key. Same exact thing for Alpha Mountain. For example, Alpha Mountain has one that gives you the capability of reaching out and asking for that API key with them. Echo Trail, same exact approach. And then, of course, Gray Noise, Hybrid Analysis, so on and so forth. You're going to need an API key in order to get started with it. Now, let's talk really quickly about kind of, the cost or reason for using some of these services before we bring them into and utilize them in LimaCharlie. First off, I usually look at API capabilities for two different purposes. The first one might be to enrich my data just at a general level. Maybe, I'm looking through logs that have public IP addresses, and I just want to know where folks are coming from, right? In this case, what we're doing is we're actually kind of just bringing in raw telemetry from either an EDR sensor or an adapter, and we're telling the API, hey, I want you to add more context to this data here for me, right? The other option is to build a detection and response rule, which is something that we'll walk through, but to build a detection and response rule around what that API returns. And there's two different kind of key differentiators there. The second one being the one that's a little more actionable. And what I mean by that is I'm making an action out of the returned API call rather than just enriching my data. And if we look at these things historically, geolocation is typically one that is used for data enrichment, maybe some post-analysis actioning, but we'll talk through how you can utilize that for detection capabilities. However, geolocation is typically one that is just used to kind of enrich data and is said, hey, I want to know where all these external IP addresses are coming from. I don't have any rhyme or reason as to whether it's good or bad right now, but I just want to add that context in, right? Versus something like a malware lookup, virus total lookup, or a hybrid analysis lookup, or some sort of hash-based or malware reference lookup. Folks, these are going to be straight shot. If this thing comes back as bad, I want you to do XYZ. There's not really much of a decision point that needs to be made there. And it's also not something I want to know 6 months from now. If I look at geolocation 6 months from now, I might want to look back and be like, oh, I see Matt went and traveled to Europe and accessed his resources, and there he was. And that lines up with his vacation request or whatever it might be, right? Thanks to him for working while he's out on vacation. I don't need to action off that right now. The flip side of that is if virus total comes back and says this thing has been recognized as bad and malicious, I need to make an action right there based off that decision point. Both capabilities are available here in LimaCharlie. The other really nice feature about this is the way I think we represent API data for you. And I'll talk about kind of what that looks like and how we pivot off of that. But there's a list of some of the APIs we've got listed here and now. I'm going to make a quick note for everyone that if you see or need an API integration that is not listed in here, please, please, please reach out to us. For anyone who's curious, we are in Slack, and Charlton over here on the LimaCharlie side just posted this out. We're in Slack in the Loud and Clear channel. If you're in our community Slack, I highly recommend jumping in and being like, hey guys, I would love to see this particular type of API integration. It's a thing that I use all the time. And I was about to just point and drop that link in there, but Charlton got me covered. If you're looking to join in our Slack, there's a link for it as well. We'd love to hear about, hey, LimaCharlie team, I would love to see this type of integration or this thing we use a lot. And if there's a way for us to make use of that data or a way for us to set that up for you, we will certainly go through the steps of doing that. Now, there's one other little point I want to drop in about our current API integrations. Right now, in its current state, our API integrations are, there's a question that just came through I'll get to in just a moment. So right now, the way that our API integrations are set up is kind of a single call API, which means if I am, let's just take, I'm going to pick one here. I'm going to pick Alpha Mountain, threat or category, for example. So Alpha Mountain category is an API call that can be used with a internet URI. So with a fully qualified domain or, a full length URL. It can help you determine, is this thing good or bad? What category does it fall in? So on and so forth, right? What we don't have, or at least what doesn't happen next, is the LimaCharlie integration here, or the Alpha Mountain integration, will not kind of spider its way through the API, which means if I get back a call that says category 7, and then I reach out and find what's that category, and then so on and so forth. What I mean by that is if you have API calls that are layered, or they return like a UUID or a GUID or some other value that you need to look up against something else, that's not really going to be the best setup in this point. What you'll want to look for is you'll want to look for APIs that offer value on that single callback, meaning I can issue a single call to a resource and I get back something that I can either ingest, enrich, or action off of right then and there. I'm calling this out in particular because lately I've been running into, especially as we get into a very API friendly world, I'm running into some APIs that are returning pointers for other API calls. And whilst I appreciate the increase in traffic that they're likely generating, I'm more careful to say, watch out for multi-layered calls. Try to find the one that can be a little bit more useful for you. So there was a question that just came through that said, is there a concept of a private API integration, AKA something that we have tooling for, but is not public? So let's deviate a little bit from the semantics of API and talk about a particular capability there, which is, could I create a private thing in LimaCharlie that only I would be able to see? And the easiest way to go through that is to actually create an extension or an add-on that would be yours. It would be something that you own or you create yourself. Now, if I go in and hop into here, an extension is a little bit different. The add-on is probably what you'll be looking for and whatnot. There's two types in here. Notice API is not called out in this one right here. However, I would almost come back and say, what type of integration is it that you're looking for? And is it something that can be maybe turned into a lookup list or somewhat of a dynamic lookup list, which is something we could work with you on building? The other thing or category that I think falls into the private API, specification here is the use of threat intelligence tools. And it could be a private threat intelligence repository, like some sort of open CTI setup or something that you've got. Or it might be like a data store or some other thing where you're like, hey, we keep track of, all the, and someone walked me through this one the other day. We keep track of all the phishing emails that we've seen over the past 30 days. And we want to look up against those sources to see, does this thing ever show up again or anything like that? Well, guess what? Take a look at the bottom of my lookup configuration down here. You can actually point a lookup to externally hosted data, in which case I can use that lookup in my detection and response rules. And I would say if I wanted to create a private lookup of sorts right now, that would be that would be the way to go about that. Now, John, you're continuing the question by saying it wouldn't be a lookup; it'd be a little bit more dynamic than that. I'm going to say let's take this conversation, and it's not a timing thing. It's more of, I'd like to understand if there's a service or a functionality that we could possibly help create for you to put that together. And if not, then maybe we'll find another way around it. But let me generalize this for everyone else out here. Again, if there's an integration or an API thing that you would like to see, let us know. If it's a service that has generic calls, but then you're running a private instance, we can look at doing it that way. If it's something that would be a little bit more processing, then or something that would be a little bit more intricate, then let's look at potentially building that out and see what that would look like. So I'll say, John, great question. Right now, without any more details, and I don't want you to publish those in the chat, without any more details, I'm going to say, let me ping you offline to see if that's maybe something we can work on. And that's a standing offer for anyone else out there as well, that, if there's something that you'd like to see built, then let's have that chat and let's make sure we get there. I will say one of the API integrations that I want to see the most, and I'm working on how to build this out, kind of, I don't want to say right now, like this minute, but it's on my plate to work through, is those private threat intelligence repositories and things like that. The reason where this gets a little tricky is typically very like the sources you want to detect against, or I should say the integrations you want to involve, a lot of times, especially from a threat intel perspective, are sometimes behind closed doors, or they're behind firewalls or things like that. They are not publicly available. So it's essentially making sure we go through and, route the, expose it correctly, punch the right holes and things like that. And that's something that we can certainly look at doing. So, but yeah, John, we'll take that conversation offline and certainly look at how to make that happen. Do me a favor, John, send me a DM before the hour is over as well, so I can get that conversation going with you. All right. But again, really great question. And just, a way to kind of get that started and a way to think about how can I, get some additional integrations in here. The other and maybe final qualifier I'll add about the marketplace in this capacity is when we talk about the differences in LimaCharlie between like an extension and an API and whatnot, it's going to be that single call that I talked about, but it's also going to be the way that APIs are exposed to you inside of the LimaCharlie platform. And that's what I want to walk into and get into next. So if I get here into my kind of test instance, if you will, and I'm just in a demo organization right now, if I hop over to organization, let me see here. I'm trying to figure out exactly where this one is going to be located here for me. And I'm just going to open everything just so we can see where it's at. You might notice there are a bunch of different capabilities in LimaCharlie about where you may or may not pull on additional data points. Like, well, if I bring in an API, is it a form of automation? Is it an extension that I would bring in? Is it part of access management? Do I insert my keys in that place and whatnot? Do I insert them there? Nope. Under organization settings, you're going to have an integrations menu. That is going to be where your API key fields are going to be listed. And you might notice, because I go through and test quite a lot, I've got quite a few fields in here, or quite a few API capabilities in here. I apologize, everyone. I'm not going to go plain text on these, but just so you can see what that population looks like. This is where those key locations are going to be at. Let me pick let me pick an instance that does not have so many enabled so we can walk through that setup process. All right, if I hop over to my add-ons marketplace, notice in this one here, I don't have VirusTotal. So right now, I don't have VirusTotal capabilities inside of this particular organization. Another important point, API capabilities are org by org. No, not kind of at a master level. It's not account by account. It's done organization by organization, and you've got to subscribe accordingly. Now, everyone here knows you can do that via as code if you'd like to. However, we'll keep it in the UI just for now. Let's say I wanted to turn on the VirusTotal integration or VirusTotal add-on. Notice that it's not listed inside of my integrations menu, number one. And number two, inside of the marketplace, the subscribe button is available. If I hit subscribe, all in the background there, all the busy squirrels are doing all their things, and they're essentially linking those capabilities together. And if I hop back over into my integrations menu, you'll notice now I've got a place to drop in my VirusTotal API key. It was that fast for me to enable this integration. So that's kind of step one, and obviously the most important step. But what happens now in the background is there's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no automated functionality that kicks in, right? VirusTotal doesn't start to integrate my data or enrich my data. And even if I were to insert an API key and hit update right now, it still doesn't go through and do any sort of automatic enrichment. Within LimaCharlie, in order for me to utilize an API integration, I need to tell the platform, here are the fields I want you to integrate or I want you to enrich against. Now, this is not done in your pure telemetry that comes in. So let's hop over into one of our sensors here, and I'm going to hop over to a test Windows sensor that I've got up and running. Here's our native telemetry. Now, if anyone's seen this one or seen me walk through this one in previous webinars, there's a ton of Windows event log activity that is kind of scattered throughout here. Let's see if I can pick one that's maybe not so noisy. We'll take our demo Linux sensor, and perfect. In this case, we can see we've got process events, network connections, so on and so forth. It's a little cleaner, a little easier for us to read through, at least for the purposes of our webinar right now. But that being said, in order for me to utilize the APIs, enable them or subscribe to them, submit your API key. At this point, there is still nothing that happens. I need to tell the platform, hey, I want you to enrich this particular data set or this particular field, this type of thing. Here's what we're not going to do in LimaCharlie. We're not going to take your native system telemetry that you'll see in an EDR sensor, or we're not going to take the native telemetry from any other log source and doctor that, if you will. Meaning, let's look at this right here. Actually, let me pick a better one. I'm going to pick this gzip right here. This was a process start for gzip approximately 3 minutes ago or so on this Linux system. In this particular case, gzip was run with a TACD parameter added to it. We see the file path of where that was located, and we see the hash associated with that, as well as some other system details. All right. Just because I've turned on VirusTotal API integration, there's not going to be anything additional added to this. There's not like a VirusTotal field that gets added here. Instead, what I have to do is I have to tell the LimaCharlie platform, hey, I want you to use the hash field from new process events and bump those up against VirusTotal. Well, where in the platform do we specify do this thing against this event? You guessed it, detection and response rules. So the way to integrate with APIs and to get those callbacks is going to be over in your detection and response rules. And I'll see if we've got a VirusTotal one, and we definitely do. So let's walk through and talk about what this looks like so we can understand how to construct and bring these events together. And I'm actually going to expand this one so we can hone in on it. But you know what? I'm going to make life a little bit easier for us. And rather than looking through all of that, I am going to instead zoom in and let's bring one more little screen part up on stage here. And I'm going to share my text editor so that way I can zoom in without messing up our browser window and it's a little easier to see. All right. So let's talk about what's happening here. So a quick reminder for everyone. We just looked at some native system telemetry, and our takeaway is we need to tell LimaCharlie, hey, here's the field within this particular event that I want you to work off of, that I want you to look up against. I'm going to start with Alpha Mountain. Alpha Mountain is a network-based API integration. A network-based API integration. So I need to be able to pinpoint a network field that I can run against. I need to be able to say, hey, here's the particular thing, the field, the whatever that I want you to run against. And I would like to make sure that, I'm looking at this particular option here. So I'm going to pick on this one right here. There we go. This is the field that I actually wanted. So the first declaration, obviously, within any detection and response rule is going to be what event is it we want to pivot against? What event is it we want to look up against? And in this case, it's going to be a DNS request. So I'm essentially telling LimaCharlie, hey, anytime a DNS request comes in, I want you to pivot against this field. I want you to do a thing against this particular field. Now, we could, of course, say event is DNS request. If it's, let's see here. If the domain name is Google, let's just keep this in here, right? We'll just google.com. This would be a typical detection and response rule for if a domain name is google.com or something like that. But I don't want a typical DNR rule in this case. I want to perform an API lookup. So our operator for that becomes lookup. Pretty straightforward. Within the event, here is the path that I want you to take and use for this lookup. And then last but not least, the only other thing we need in here is going to be what resource are we looking up against? Meaning, and I'll break this down into English. Hey, LimaCharlie, anytime you see a DNS request, I would like you to take the domain name from that DNS request and push that up against the Alpha Mountain category API key. Now notice, at no point in time are we declaring the key inside of our detection and response rule. At no point in time are we needing to go any further. We're not creating any other specifications in here. Now, I'm not going to ask the audience, but I'll give everyone a really quick minute to think about this one. How noisy of a rule do you think this is going to be? How noisy of a rule do you think this is going to be? Depending on the size of your environment, this is going to be extremely noisy. Why? Because every single EDR sensor you've got deployed, I'm assuming, is collecting DNS request activity. So this is where I have to insert my first pro tip when it comes to API integrations. Take a look at the volume or the quantity that you're allowed, the limits that you've got inside of your API, and you might reach those really quickly if you go kind of carte blanche with a rule like this. So of course, like with any detection and response rule, we might want to insert different parameters, meaning I might only want to perform a lookup against internal systems inside of a dev environment or domain controllers or Windows versus Linux or something else like that. I might want to drop little qualifiers inside of my detection and response rule that lets me drop those filters in. That can be very useful because it's going to limit the amount of requests that you send out. And it's going to obviously save you on that API resource utilization if you've got it there. If you've got an unlimited API key, fantastic, just blast away. Otherwise, we might want to find ways to trim that down. So, and I know we've done webinars and we've done series on crafting detection and response rules before. I won't go too much into the specification with that here, but there are obviously ways to kind of pare down what this runs against. I would recommend obviously looking at those options if you need to, or just see how much volume comes out of this. And I'll tell you why in just a minute or two, why that volume is going to affect you very, very much. So that's our basic setup. One of the important things that I'll call out is this LCR, this ARN reference that we've got. This is something inside of LimaCharlie where you're essentially referring to another type of resource that's in the platform. You'll see these LCR, these ARN values used in services, extensions. If I want to reference like a secret or something like that, you'll see them referenced in that capacity as well. These are ways to reference other parts of the platform. And in this case, obviously, we're referencing a particular API. So in case you're worried about, hey, what is that syntax, Matt? I've never seen that before. It's a very custom ARN specific to the LimaCharlie platform. If you go and drop this into like a web browser, it's obviously not going to render anything because it's not a legitimate address. And I wouldn't recommend, kind of going that route. Now, there's a couple of places we can pivot here to say, well, how do I want to pare or whittle this content down? Or what do I want to do with these API calls when they come back? I'm going to bring up another quick window here. We're going to go back to our LimaCharlie browser. We've got that key in there or that API lookup that we had in there before. I'll come back to that one in just a moment. But let me show you all what happens. So I've got a detection and response rule in place. And I believe the one that we just looked at was actually this one right here. It was the Alpha Mountain. I'm calling it Alpha Mountain test, but it was an Alpha Mountain category lookup against DNS requests from a domain name perspective. Like any detection and response rule, anytime a detection gets fired, it's going to show up in my detection and response window or my detections window, or it's going to show up in that it's a detection. For all intents and purposes, it's a detection, which means the content that gets returned from that API call is going to be represented in the detections window. This is another little bit of a different takeaway for folks to understand. We're not adding the response from that API call into the sensor telemetry. Remember, this event didn't come from a sensor. It came from an API call that was issued and whatnot. Oh, and I can see I've got to go back a little bit in time, I think, to actually get this one brought up here. So let me see if I can't maybe throw a different time frame in to see if I can get some different results and whatnot. But nonetheless, I'm going to see if I can pull those back. But when you get a response back from an API call, it's going to be represented in the detections window, which is going to be kind of the next place we're going to move to or gravitate towards from an analysis perspective. I'm just going to bring up my detections and actually get rid of all of my filters. Nope, we're not going to do that. Apologies, I clicked the wrong thing. We'll do this right here. We're going to go to the present and we're going to filter again. I'm going to see if we can't find any recent API calls in our browser window here that we could use to potentially walk through this one more time. You'll notice this is a very, very noisy setup inside of here as well. Okay, perfect. I actually do have some in here that we can use. We've got an echo trail API call. I won't jump around anymore. We're going to stick with this one API so we can walk through it. Let's talk about Echo Trail. Echo Trail is an API service that you can use against a file name or a hash value. So we talked about Alpha Mountain just a minute ago. Those are network-based APIs. Pangea is going to be file or network or IP or username. Echo Trail is one, and a huge props over to Brian Kincannon, who runs Echo Trail, has made an awesome service that allows you to look up an MD5, a SHA-256, or a Windows file name with an extension, and it pulls back different metadata about that. So let's take a look. We've actually got inside of the subscription window. You can ignore these 3 ticks at the end here. We're going to go all the way up here. That's what our detection and response rule is going to look like for an Echo Trail API. Again, we've kind of called out exactly what it does here, but we're going to take a new process. We're we're going to take a new process event. We're going to look up the file path against EchoTrail. Let's go ahead and see exactly what that would look like, because I'm curious to know what does that particular event look like if that comes through? So I'm going to hop over into a sensor timeline. Let's take our new process. And in this case right here, and again, let me just double check. Our event file path is the one that we're looking for. If I take a look at my event file path, there it is right there. Now I'm on a Linux system in this case, but that file path is going to be the full file path of that particular process that executed. If I hop over into Windows, this one's going to be a little noisier, but that's okay. We'll see if we can find, oh, we do have a new process event. There we go. There's my file path once again inside of that particular Windows event. I'm going to move my camera to the bottom of the screen just to get rid of it. I was actually hoping this might be a little bit cleaner. There we go. I'm not over on top of it anymore, but that's what our file path field is going to be. It's going to be the full path of that particular process that was found in that event. So again, if I put my detection in plain English, hey, LimaCharlie, anytime you see a new process event, I want you to take the file path and run that up against EchoTrail. That's what our detection and response rule is doing. Now, let's go back down over into our detection to see what came back when we ran that particular detection. There's a whole bunch of stuff that came back from that. All right. Now, interestingly enough, and this is going to be an interesting thing. This is going to be a really, really fun thing to look through right here. But let's go ahead and see what we can do from this particular perspective. So in my detection and response rule, we have the name of the rule itself. And I'm just going to make life a little bit easier. And I'm actually going to just filter on our EchoTrail API calls so that we can kind of clean this screen up a little bit. And we're not looking at a whole bunch of detections in one place. But there we go. There's my EchoTrail insight rules, which are hopefully going through and utilizing or looking against some of our process executions. If I take a look at the detection itself, I accidentally clicked out. Give me just a moment. Let me refilter back in there so we can make sure we're looking at the same data we had before. If I look at the detection that fired, you'll notice there's a lot of different data points inside of here. Now, as with any event in LimaCharlie, we're going to expose everything that we can to you so that you can action off these and consume them in any way you need to. At a very high level, the detection is going to have the general detection information, the source rule, the link, detection ID, so on and so forth. Within the detect JSON data is going to be the event that triggered itself, meaning the event that caused this thing to fire. Because this was a process execution, that new process data is carried over into this event here for me. See, look, there's my file path right there. There's my full command line that was run against this. All of this is already inside of the platform. If you're looking to pivot off of what comes back from the API, then this MTD, this metadata field, is going to be the one that you want to pivot against. And notice in this case right here, our metadata contains the feedback from API EchoTrail Insights, which comes back and says it has never observed this particular executable exit in the wild. So there's our response from EchoTrail. I was hoping to see if we could get one that maybe had executed in the wild so we could get some additional context back from it. Let me try another one here just to see if I can get some additional EchoTrail insight. But it's okay. I'm totally fine with my API saying, hey, I've never seen this thing before in the wild, so I don't have much data that I can kind of return back to you or whatnot. I might look and see if we've got any virus total ones to look through. And it's taken me a moment to get some of these detections pulled up here. Doesn't mean they're not working because I know they're enabled. I can hop over in my detection and response window and I can see that these things are, and they should be, some are turned on, some are turned off, but the one that I want is actually turned on, which is good. So I can see I should have my VT hashes. And let's pause and take a look at what's happening right here. So just to refresh or to remind everyone where we're at. When I issue an API call, I get back a detection. And inside of that detection is the original event that fired the detection, as well as the metadata returned from the API call. For the Echo Trail example we just looked at, it came back and said, I've never seen this thing in the wild before. Every single other API call is going to return that metadata field. This is where the decision-making process comes into place, because the metadata that comes back from the API call is actually what I want to action against. Again, if I'm making this an actionable call, that's the data that I actually want to action against. So interestingly enough, and I'm going to pull up our documentation for this one in just a moment here, but interestingly enough, we've added something into the detection and response rule capability that allows you to go through and pivot on the metadata events. And that's exactly what's being called out in the middle of this detection and response rule right here. So let's walk through this rule and see what's happening. This rule is pivoting off of a code identity event. We are doing our lookup operator. We are going to take the hash that's from that code identity event and bump that up against VT or against virus total. However, I'm going to qualify my detection and response rule a little bit further, not by, excuse me, not by defining a platform, not by defining a tag or some other qualifier, but I'm going to say, hey, LimaCharlie, I want you to examine the metadata that comes back. And before you even tell me about what's happening, I want you to look for this particular hash has been found or has been true, meaning it's been identified in virus total with a value greater than 3. Let me break this down into plain English. Every time a code identity event fires, LimaCharlie, take the hash, run that up against the virus total API key. If virus total comes back and says more than 3 engines have detected this thing as malicious, fire that detection. The cool thing about this is that I'm able to insert some blocks or some logic into the detection and response rule so that I'm not looking at thousands and thousands of rules being tripped, which are actually just API integrations. And it's a really, really valuable resource to be able to say, not only do I want you to enrich, but I also want you to only fire a detection if a particular thing is detected or if a particular qualifier is met. And if I go back and I look at our different API integrations, there's lots of things you're going to want to pivot on against all of these. For example, in Echo Trail, if I wanted to say, you know what, only fire a detection if Echo Trail says this thing is malicious or this thing has been seen in the wild, only fire a detection. Otherwise, I'm not really too interested in it. Alpha Mountain category, only fire a detection if it's in a malicious category. If it's a category associated with something I shouldn't see in a workplace or some other environment like that. Hybrid analysis, same exact approach. Take that SHA-256, and if it comes back or if it gets returned as malicious, let's definitely go ahead and fire a detection. So again, inside of the DNR rule is where you'll get the qualifiers that you're looking for to help you kind of say, all right, I am interested in this thing as long as particular categories are met. IP geolocation, again, a very, very similar type of output here, where I'm looking against DNS requests. We're going to take the external IP from that geolocation, and we're going to perform that IP geolocation lookup. Now, same logic applies, and I'll kind of hypothesize or posit this one. You can probably picture where our API integrations are going from here. If I just want to enrich that data and say, hey, take every single external IP, geolocate it, and then give me a detection associated with all those different events, we're good to go, right? We're done. I'm going to turn this on right here, right now. In other cases, we might use that virus total qualifier in order to say, hey, here's how I want you to find that particular thing. The nice thing about this particular setup, in my opinion, is that I'm able to control at the detection and response level what fires, what doesn't, and with what level of severity I'm going to start to really listen or pay attention to that particular thing. Because my goal is to understand, I want to know if something's bad. I don't necessarily want to look at every single enriched data point. I want to instead just look at the things that my API integrations tell me are bad. I'm also going to make a really quick adjustment to one of these just to see what happens in this case. Let's take a look at our Echo Trail Insights API integration. And you'll notice in this case right here, we pivot against the file path of this particular location. We pivot against the file path of that process that gets executed. If I look at my API integration, however, and understanding whether, what type of field it's looking for in this case, it might not be interested in it might not be interested in the full path. It might be interested in just the file name itself, meaning has this file name ever been seen? Has this file name thing ever been observed before? So if I wanted to make a change to that, we don't have to go change the API integration. We don't have to make any changes to the way we structure the call. We simply just need to make a change against the field that we pivot against. So rather than pulling the full file path, I might instead parse that out. I might look at the command line parameters, or I might look against kind of the parent information or something if I wanted to. The nice part about managing your detection and response rules and the way they integrate with API keys here is that it's really, really easy for me to just make little changes and data tweaks as need be. Now, I turned on our IP geolocation detection and response rule. I'm going to see if this one's kind of churning in the background and performing lookups. It depends on how many different DNS requests we have running at this point and whether or not we've got crazy detection activity being driven. But nonetheless, that theory, that idea, that concept is going to remain the same of I can pivot an API lookup against any data source that's out there and use that to enrich or write detection and response rules against. Remember, and I'm kind of at a summary of today's webcast today, or today's webinar, today's loud and clear session. Remember, the way that you utilize an API integration can either be to simply enrich data, and then I have detections associated with that enriched data point, or I can use the API integration for decision making. So I can say only fire a detection if this particular API metadata contains something of interest. And that can be valuable for malware lookups, geolocation. If I had to hypothesize one for a geolocation, we might say, hey, I'm interested in all traffic from everywhere, but if traffic comes from an embargoed nation or a system is reaching out to an embargoed nation or something like that, then I really, really want to know about it. So I might, fire a detection rule a little bit differently. And in this case right here, we've got a really straightforward rule kind of driven out about a geolocation API integration. In this case right here, it's pivoting off the metadata rules, and it's looking for instances of where a country is within the European Union. So again, it really depends on how you want to kind of slice and dice and work your way through the data in order to get the kind of the representation and the decision making that you're looking for. The last little piece that I will mention in here is the ability to chain different detection events together. So like every telemetry stream I've ever talked about and LimaCharlie represents, and let's head back to our Echo Trail Insights in this case, just so we can kind of take a look at those again. For every telemetry stream that gets created, or for every detection that gets created, folks, these events themselves are observable events. So the other thing that I could do is I could say, you know what? I want to enrich every single process execution that's ever been found, meaning I want all that enrichment data inside of LimaCharlie. However, I also want to action against that in case a particular thing happens. So you kind of want the best of both worlds, right? Well, the way to do that, and we've actually already kind of got this, and I think we've talked about this in a couple of different webinars and different setups and stuff like that, is to actually detect against the detection itself. And I'm going to bring an example over. I'm hoping this one is still rendered clearly. Perfect. In LimaCharlie, you've got the ability to detect on an alternate target, meaning I can write a detection rule against a detection and response rule. And this part's really cool because, again, it lets me say, you know what, perform all the enrichments. I want to see everything, but then I also want to detect against certain cases. So there's an example rule in here of actually pivoting on a virus total hit. So take a look. Let's walk through the first part right here. Here's that sample compound detection and response rule. In this case right here, I've got a DNR rule that's looking for another detection to fire. And if that detection is named virus total hit, which will align with the rule that we create in the first place, and if the system where this fires, and again, it's an example, but if the system where this thing fires is the CEO laptop, here's what I want you to do. Send that thing off to PagerDuty, fire all cannons, let everybody know that something is happening, but let's light up every single source that we can. Here's the unique part about this. I am still going to get in my detection and response rule, my original one, I'm still going to get all the virus total hits in my detections window if, of course, it trips whatever logic I've inserted in that original rule. But instead of in that original rule, instead of me saying, and system equals CEO laptop, then do this thing. Because let's just say hypothetically, and I'm going to use a really easy C-suite example here. Let's say I wanted to write this rule, but I wanted to have it apply to the CEO laptop, the CFO's laptop, and the COO's laptop. Well, we could drop some different logic parameters in here if we wanted to, but let's say I wanted to handle things a little bit differently. Let's just say if it's a C-suite laptop, I want to notify PagerDuty. If it's middle management laptop, I want to notify Slack. For whatever reason, we want to have our outputs be different based on system severity. That would be really tough to maintain and manage from within a single detection and response rule. But by taking that original rule, which is based on virus total metadata, and branching out to whatever capability I need, it gives me much more granularity and control over what I do when a particular rule fires. And I can make changes as I need to based in certain places. So the act of creating a detection and response rule for API enrichment allows me to then action upon that detection itself. And hopefully everyone followed me down that logic tree there, but it's a really important parameter and a really powerful capability within the platform because it lets me get very controlling over what happens with my data. But let me just summarize up here for everyone because we're almost out of time and I'd like to make sure I open up for any questions. And of course, for those of you kind of just joining us or maybe checking us out for the first time, in our community Slack, we do have a loud and clear channel where we try to keep this discussion going on. Highly recommend you jump us in there. A huge thanks to everyone. But what we did today is took a look at the different API integrations available within LimaCharlie. We've got a wide range available here, but as I mentioned multiple times, if there's something you don't see that you would like to see, let us know. We'll happily look at kind of what it would take to build that out and get this in here. There was a question that came up about private API integrations. I'm going to ask you to bring those conversations directly to me if you've got questions. We also looked at the ways that I would utilize an API, either to enrich my data or to create a detection and response rule based on the data that comes back. We walked through a few different examples. We looked at one for Echo Trail based off of process data. We looked at Alpha Mountain for network data, Virus Total for hash-based data, something like Pangea for those different types of fields as well. And IP geolocation would pivot off of external IP or public-facing IP so that we could actually look those up. Finally, we also took a look at saying, well, what if I wanted to pivot based on the results of an API lookup? That would be done from a detection and response perspective. I would be detecting on a detection rule, which means I'd be chaining detections together. But with that said, everyone, thank you so much. API integrations are a really powerful capability here within LimaCharlie, a really, really powerful one. And I highly recommend checking these things out if you can. If you're utilizing some sort of API integration, or if you're moving into LimaCharlie and you've got another API integration that you're used to using, you can bring that in here as well and use it to enrich and action off that data. I'm going to happily keep the chat open for another few minutes. If anyone's got any questions, I will take the screen off stage and have just myself up here. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to tackle those over the next couple of minutes. If not, we'll move our conversation to the Slack channel. A huge thanks to everyone for joining me here today. It's great to have folks here. I hope everyone's seeing some value in the way they can bring the platform together and some ways that they can chain together different events and often other capabilities that you've got out there. But with that said, we'll move our conversation to Slack. Huge thanks to everyone. Looking forward to our next one, our next webinar series. Check out the Slack channel, watch your emails and all the socials for all the different things that we'll be doing soon. We've got a few webinars and capabilities planned for the the rest of 2023. But with that said, I will see y'all in our different mediums. Thanks again for joining me today. And if you're watching the recording of this and you have any questions, by all means, please feel free to reach out to the team. We would happily answer those in the future if we can. With that said, everyone, thanks. Have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you again on our next Loud and Clear series. Thanks.